Okay, I really appreciate, Susanna, that you started to do some thinking about some of the other presentations we had today, because I've been thinking the same thing all along, right, as the days have been going on, and how some of this that I'm going to say is maybe repetitive or certainly reflects back on some of the themes we've already heard. So I apologize in advance if that's true, and I hope I can have some unique look at this, but I do think that the fact that we are hearing some themes and some through lines is actually important, since none of us spoke to each other about what we were going to be talking about. So that does say something. So where are we now, and how did we get here? So I'm talking about whither are we bound, but we have to understand where we came from, right? And in preparing for this, I was reading through Bob Brennan's introduction to the latest edition of Educational Measurement in 2006. And he argues that the theoretical models are getting more and more sophisticated. And at the same time, societal issues are so influential that the boundaries between testing and societal issues often get blurred. And I would argue that, we've seen rapid change in the development of measurement theory and increasingly sophisticated measurement models, but there's been little change, in the essential questions that we have to answer. And we've heard that today, right? We still have to worry about things like reliability and validity and fairness and accessibility and all of those things. And when I'm going to take a little more of a prosaic approach to what things we have to worry about too a little bit later on in the talk. To Brennan's second point, maybe it's overstating it, but it seems that we find ourselves at a time when our work has much more than just academic and theoretical impact. People are asking many more questions about what it is that we do and how we do it. Brennan points out that there wasn't even in the first couple of editions of Educational Measurement, there wasn't much treatment of equating, because it really wasn't until people started to look at things like concordances and so on, that people started to say, hey, wait, how do you do this? And how do you ensure that this is actually, comparable and so on? With all the pressure that's on testing right now, people do ask a lot of questions. So we have a lot more ability to impact, local and national policy making. And our tests are being used for accountability in schools, and some of our qualitative folks are doing some really interesting groundbreaking work in social justice movements, or as we've seen today in some of the work they're doing in labs, and understanding collaboration and understanding the psychological bond between a therapist and patient. So we really have to think about that. When we began our careers, when Mike was talking about logical positivism and so on, I guess dispositionally, at least the way I was raised to think that there was all about the rules, I was like, oh, why is that dead? The whole kitchen sink, empiricism appeals to me to a certain extent. Just throw a bunch of stuff into a model, see what it comes up, and okay, that predicts, so let's just use that and let's not have to think about it too much. That's ridiculous. I'm overstating it. I don't really believe that. But there is something that is easier about that than having to struggle with things that we have to struggle with. So what's being asked of us now? Well, we are being asked for even more authentic solutions. We've heard about those today. But there was an interesting blog post within the last couple of weeks by Martin Roeder, who's the CEO of ACT. Alina's, taking a picture of it because it's her boss, and And he's talking about going from fixed to the personalized to adaptive. And Susanna was talking about assessment, being this flexible thing as opposed to standardized. And the question is, are tests becoming more like assessments? And I think this is the same thing here, where we're being asked to be more flexible, more assessment-like. From the focus on the cognitive skills to the holistic social and emotional skills. And I was joking with Nathan earlier because, to hear Randy and others in the educational space talk about these new constructs that we're going to measure, and then the IO people are kind of like, seriously? We've been doing that for a really long time. But, what's new to the ed people are not necessarily new to psychology writ large. This whole idea of wait. Oh, and we used to have weeks. We used to have weeks after an SAT was given before we had to report scores. It was lovely. right, Godem? We used to have, we'd be able to really, take our time. People they are not waiting anymore. They don't want to wait. They want their results right away. They want feedback immediately. Artificial to authentic. All right, so people would argue that being in a standardized testing situation is an artificial thing, and we've heard that today. We've heard that about that artificial feel rather than an authentic immersive experience. Some people talked about embedded assessment, which was interesting too. And then we're going to get to that because the intrusive, which is, okay, you're sitting down, you've signed up to take the GRE, you've showed up to the test center. It's intrusive in the sense that, this is not something you normally do with your day, as opposed to more invisible or stealth. But I'd argue that we need to be a little careful about the stealth part. This was in the news last couple of weeks. I think we're all aware of the Cambridge Analytica issues and the stuff that came through with a researcher collecting data supposedly for a research study, which then it turned into data that were being used to target political ads and parse people into personality groups to see what kind of ads would really resonate with them. Maybe I'm being a little overly nervous about this, but I don't know. It's not feeling good right now. And when we talk about stealth assessment and when we talk about gathering process data, there's going to be that push and pull between the how much do we have to let people know, and ethically, we do have to let people know what is being gathered and how it's being used, because none of us want to be in a situation where we've been accused of things like this. And just as an aside, I just always thought this was funny, and you don't see this in the press, but anybody know who this guy is? Yes, Lisa? Parscale. That's right, Brad Parscale, I guess. That's how they pronounce his name, and my husband tells me that means what, many stairs or something, Seth? Parscale? What? I don't know. Yes, you do, you told me the other night. Uh-oh, I made him wake up, sorry. So Brad Parscale, his name is spelled like Parscale, which is an IRT software package. And so I just think that's hilarious, but nobody in the press has picked that up. And I guess it's just a psychometric joke, right? Okay, I'll move on. So what tools, though, do we have to ensure integrity in our profession? Because as Seth and I were actually talking about this, even though he seems to forget, we were talking about, he asked, is there a code of ethics or anything like that? And we don't license psychometricians. We don't license people. We license clinical psychologists, but we don't license psychometricians. But we do have, I found a couple of things which probably should be more top of mind than they were. The Code of Professional Responsibilities in Educational Measurement. Our very own Kurt Geisinger served on the committee, the ad hoc committee that put this together. So we do have a code of responsibility. We have the Code of Fair Testing Practices in Education, put out by the Joint Committee on Testing Practices. So it is good that we have these things, as well as the standards. And I think we owe it to ourselves and ourselves as a community to make sure that we're adhering to said standards. At ETS, every testing program goes through a fairly comprehensive audit every 3 years against the standards. We've translated the AARA, APA, NCME standards into the ETS standards because they also involve some operational pieces and some issues around customer satisfaction and so on. But we do look at them and we give them ratings, and the ratings go to the Board of Trustees, and theoretically if a testing program is really doing poorly or it's brought to their attention and it could theoretically get stopped. I've never seen it happen, that's why I keep saying theoretically. But perhaps one of the reasons it hasn't happened is because we have some degree of vigilance. But in the meantime, what's happening on the ground? And this is where I tend to get a little more prosaic. Since I mentioned before, I'm a general manager, I don't really understand that title. They came up with that title for the people that are right below the officer level, but it feels like I should have a baseball team, right? I mean, what does it mean, general manager? But because of that, I'm at a point where I supervise quite a few people the psychometricians and the data analysts who actually have to get the work done. So despite the rapid changes taking place, I mentioned this before, we still have to worry about, the inferences that are being drawn from our assessments and the evidence that we have to support those inferences and so on. But from a more practical perspective, many operational testing programs, if you start to look under the hood and, spend a little time with us here, and I assume it's the same at other testing companies that have to put out, that really have to turn around results quickly and efficiently, we adhere to really well-documented and well-understood procedures in order to get our work done efficiently, accurately. We're held to extremely high standards of quality, operational quality, as well as psychometric quality. And you can't do that if, every testing administration is a research project, right? The data are, we know, our data analysts know when's the admin date and when the data are coming in and when the IA are going to be done so that we can talk to our colleagues in assessment development and discuss any items that aren't working and get with the equating if it's a post-equated test. We know exactly, when we have to have things delivered all the way through to the downstream processes. And there's a tension there, right? Because we have all these great sophisticated models, but if you don't have time within the operational window to really be examining these things, it's all for naught. It's even been a little embarrassing sometimes when we've had external audits to have people say, you're doing that this way, why? But again, and it's not just a matter of the quality and the efficiency, but a lot of testing programs also are very concerned, and as they should be, on their historical trends, right? There may be reasons why there are changes in test score trends over time, but they shouldn't be because we messed up in terms of equating. It should be because there are changes in the population taking the test or something else that's going on in the world, because they're depending on us to be the stable yardstick. So, and it's really hard because that really limits your ability then to innovate, and that's where we're at that tension. So this imposes some challenges, doesn't it? Because as we move to digital delivery, we're finding out that it's not happening with a clean cutover. I think it was Randy who talked about the fact that in California they were boasting of all this online delivery in the California assessment. Well, the Department of Ed person did not mention the fact that there's still a lot of paper in California. A lot may be overstating it, but there's still a paper program. And it's in the Waldorf schools. Some of you may be familiar with the Rudolf Steiner Waldorf schools. And guess who sends their kids to the Waldorf schools? The tech giants. They all send their kids to these Waldorf schools where they hardly even start to read till about second grade, and they never touch electronics. And so they have to have paper in California for the Waldorf schools. And we are supporting that. And, we're trying to make some statements about comparability. We had a meeting at the College Board a couple of weeks ago, and they're planning on having a full adaptive digital SAT by 2022, but they're going to be moving towards it. And even in 2022, they acknowledge that there's probably still going to have to be paper. And we're going to have to deal with the fact that we've got a couple of things going on. And sure, there's studies you can do to take a look at the comparability between paper and computer-delivered assessments or digitally delivered assessments. But the more that you engage with the advantages that technology offers, like technology-enhanced items and so on, that you can't do in paper, it really speaks to, well, what are you going to do again about that tension? So some of the questions are, what can we do about improving the construct and score comparability across the modes, right? And as I mentioned before, the use of these great models is wonderful, but how do we fit that in, and how do we ensure that that somehow becomes part of our everyday operational work? One of the things we're engaging in my area is a rethinking of our analysis system. Our analysis system is about, I don't know, I want to say 15, 20 years old. How old is Genesis? Anybody? Anybody? It's old, right? And we are really, really looking at it like, okay, we've got to be more modular, more flexible. We've got to really rethink how we're doing this, because we are going to be asked to do we are going to be asked to look at process data. We are going to be asked to look at a lot of other things. I know they've had some challenges in NAEP, and this is not necessarily digitally related, but more from a content perspective. Well, so in NAEP, they're doing great things in terms of introducing new item types and new constructs and really trying to measure, science, and the new science standards, the NGSS standards are really, they're interesting, they're hard to write items for. These are very different things that we're doing, and yet we're expected to maintain trends in NAEP, right? It's the nation's report card. So again, that tension is an interesting tension that we're undergoing right now. So what can we do better? Well, I would argue that there's a couple of things we can do, and I'll start out by saying that new psychometricians, I would argue, still need an excellent grounding in the basics, as well as in the newer models. Last year at the conference on teaching statistics and quantitative methods, Joe had made the point that he had been going through the APA area where they sell books and stuff and looked at all the intro stat books that are used in undergraduate courses. And not only did they all look like each other, but they looked like stuff that you would have used 20 years ago, right? And how different that was from what is happening at the graduate level. And while I would argue that certainly, well, you don't see that much undergraduate psychometrics necessarily, but certainly methods courses, undergraduate psychology methods courses need a grounding in the basics. And also in the newer models. But the reason I'm focusing on the basics is, let me show you just something kind of fun. This is a pop quiz, okay? Pop quiz, art history is the topic. Ready? Name the artist. Nope. Mary Cassatt was one of the, that was a Jeopardy answer the other day though, Mary Cassatt. Sorry? Nope. Picasso. This is Picasso when he was 15 years old. Okay? Yeah, this is Picasso in 1890-something, 1896, I think. Yeah. This is Picasso in 1962. My point is that Picasso could not have broken ground and been a genius if he didn't have the basics, right? If he didn't have the grounding in composition, in painting, in drawing. That's his mother, by the way, on the left. That's Jacqueline on the right, one of his lovers, I guess. So that is part of the evolution of Picasso. But how do we get folks, one of the things that I struggle with is how do we move from the novice to the expert? How do we make that move so that people, well, there's even, if we think about the novice, this is not novice work, obviously. The Picasso at 15 is way beyond novice drawing. But if you think about the emerging artist, getting to the point where, yes, they can do the kind of thing Picasso could do when he was 15, and then beyond, how do we train people up for that? Part of the downside of this business that I was talking about being so regulated, about producing scores, and we have standard operating procedures, and we have a quality management system, and we have documents we're supposed to pull down, and we're supposed to follow steps A, B, C, D. I don't want people to put their brains on hold, right, and just follow the rules. They've got to keep thinking about the data. You're doing an equating, you're looking at these data, and you're saying to yourself, is this form easier or harder than the reference form? Who are these people? Are they scoring, and are they more able, are they less able on this construct? You're telling yourself a story about this as you're moving. You should be. And there's a tension between the need for automated systems and push to get things out the door, and making sure that people are smart enough and data sensitive enough so that they will raise a flag when something goes wrong, so that we don't have mistakes and we don't have problems. Because not only do mistakes and problems hurt the brand and hurt the organization and leave us open to legal action, that's true, but people's lives may be affected, right? People who are expecting test scores, they want to move on with their lives for whatever reason. We don't want to negatively affect anyone's life. So I would argue that in addition to the grounding, we also need to recruit and train for people who can grow their critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And we need to figure out how to work better, and a bunch of people have talked about this today, across a range of disciplines, right? Data scientists, neurologists, neuropsychologists, philosophers of science, engineers. How do we create space for that kind of cooperation. And I love the idea of some of the work that like Lisa was doing where, you're trying to figure out, and I was wondering about that whole, even within ETS, between research and my group and PAR, there's a little bit of a, well, we know better about this, and well, we know that, and self-identification, which is great, and people need to take pride in that, but we also need to acknowledge others' expertise and be able to come together. And I don't know how we create a space for that quite yet, but I think we do need to figure it out. I think it was, Susanna was talking about, neuropsychology too as well, right? And where some of that's going. And somebody else was, it was Mark talking about the sand with the pieces of metals, trying to figure out what was in the big thing of sand. I would have put that together for you, by the way, if you had asked, But I was thinking, that's like, what if you picked up the thing of sand and you put it through a PET scan, right? And what can a PET scan and other things like that tell us about some of the things we might be interested in? I don't know. Talk about intrusive, though. But these are things that, I don't know what the next leap is going to be yet in psychometrics. We're looking at process data, we're looking at more sophisticated models, but when are we going to have that next real leap? Learning from the past. I thought this was interesting, too, in Bob's chapter. He mentioned that in 1995, E.F. Lindquist applied for a patent for the first optical scanner. So it made it possible to scan, answer sheets from a multiple choice test really, really quickly and very inexpensively. But Brennan pointed out that, this might have had some unintended consequences. We, as a country, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do multiple choice testing because it was easy, it was cheap, you could get things turned around quickly. But any thought of perhaps going into, having other kinds of tests, like, which they never got away from really in Europe, essay exams and so on, and other forms of assessment got shoved to the rear. Now, that wasn't only because of the scanner. It had a lot to do with the way psychology developed in this country as opposed to in other countries. But it's an interesting thing to consider that this piece of technology, which really isn't about measurement, it just helps us get the data quicker, and how much that changed that cost. And when's our next optical scanner moment? Is it here? Is it digital delivery and the ability to do technology-enhanced items? If it isn't, will we know it when it comes? And I think that was all I had. Just a bunch of questions. Fascinating, right?